Hey everybody, this is Mark with New England Debate, here with a Q&A on a few debate theory questions. Before I get into that, however, signups for Spring 2023 classes with New England Debate are now open. In addition to debate coaching and debate workshops, which you can see the information for at newenglanddebate.com, I am also offering an Economics 101 class where we will focus mostly on microeconomics because that's really the foundations of the subject. And I'm doing a film and religion class, a kind of sequel to the very well-received film class I did this past semester, where we will specifically be diving into films and how they portray various religions, looking at both content and style. So signups for that are just a click away from the front page at newenglanddebate.com. Now let's get into the theory questions. There are 4 big theory questions that I got, starting with the first one, which is how do you argue theory in the round? So kind of a basics, how do you actually debate theory? And I have 4 steps to this. The first one is to understand what debate theory is. And what it is a kind of way to police the kinds of arguments that teams are allowed to run in the round. Now, of course, there are no rules about this. It is not policed, unlike a sport. It is not policed by the league. We have debate theory because what kinds of arguments should be allowed is a conversation that's had between debaters and judges. That is what debate theory is about. It is a sort of meta debate. What kinds of things should we say that the teams are allowed to say or not say? So fundamentally, debate theory is about what is acceptable to maintain the activity of debate. What, if we allowed it, would cause debate to either be completely unfun and undesirable because, for instance, maybe if we allowed a particular type of argument, one team would or one side of the debate would essentially win every debate round. That would be a bad the thing we shouldn't allow. Or what makes, if allowed, would make debate completely uneducational and just bad. That's kind of the core of debate theory, and you have to understand that pretty much all debate theory goes back to these principles. The second thing you should do to argue theory better in a round is to prepare and understand the theory arguments that you're going to be making. Now, in NCFCA and STOA, the most common debate theory argument is going to be topicality. But in teams, I think pretty much they should be preparing for topicality, but if you're planning on running other theory arguments or you think you might encounter other theory arguments, prepare those and think about them ahead of time, discuss with people, and write briefs for them. That doesn't mean going out and finding evidence, but it means sitting down and meticulously laying out the arguments that you're going to be running, and specifically a wide range of arguments and thinking about how those arguments interact. One of the great things about debate theory, and I think one of the reasons we don't have kind of rules that dictate this, is because the actual exercise of thinking through debate theory is a really good training ground for abstract thinking, for very strict logical abstract thinking that we do see in other aspects of debate, but is really intensified with debate theory. So go ahead and actually do that thinking and write your thoughts down and make a brief. The third thing to do in preparation for arguing theory in a round is make sure you're arguing theory arguments for a good reason. Now, what are some good reasons? Well, one, it could be strategic. It could be that you legitimately think it's the best argument to make to help you win the round. It could be that you simply want to test something. Maybe you don't understand or know whether or not it's actually going to be strategic or beneficial to winning the round, but you don't care about that as much, and you'd rather try an argument out just as an intellectual exercise. I would say that's a perfectly fine reason. Maybe you legitimately think that a particular thing is harming the activity and you want to discourage it in the future by arguing this theory argument in order to influence how other debaters debate and improve the activity. Those, I think, are all fine reasons to argue theory arguments. What is a bad reason to argue theory. The main one is that I've seen in NCFCA and STOA, and probably that I did when I was debating back in the day, because I was a big theory nerd. I didn't win much with it, but I really enjoyed it. But a bad reason to do it is to feel superior to other teams. That's the main one I see, to feel superior to them or to try to confuse them into a win. So maybe you think you're really good at debate theory and you get into a round and the other team you know is very inexperienced, but you know the judge is an alumni who's also a theory nerd. And so you run all these arguments that you know the judges are going to understand, but the other team is just completely confused the entire time. That's not sporting. It's not very nice, and it's just a bad reason to run theory arguments, especially when you probably in that situation, if you're much more experienced than the other team, probably could have won with a more straightforward strategy that was actually understandable to them. So don't do that. That's just mean. And finally, what do you actually do in the round? Well, what you do in the round is largely dictated by your preparation. So prepare a wide variety of responses and level of explanation for the argument, and then cater that to the judge. And that usually means in the NCFCA and STOA to be prepared to spend a lot of time on your theory argument. It's not something you just throw out there quickly and assume that they understand the intricacies of it. They may not have heard of it before, and you may need to be prepared to go back to the very roots of debate theory, like what I talked about. Here is what debate theory actually is, and go through the entire process of explaining step by step what your argument is. Now you may be thinking, well, then that seems like a lot of time. Yeah, maybe that factors into the strategic decision you have there. Is it worth the time it's going to take to actually do it well and communicate it to your judge? That's a trade-off you got to make. You can't just say, well, my judge didn't understand my argument even though it was brilliant. Well, you didn't cater the argument to your judge, and it's unrealistic to think that every judge should understand the argument in the time that you want the argument to take. That's hubristic. Do not do that. But get your theory briefs to the point where you can explain it front to back. And then obviously, depending on your judge and what you know about your judge, you can get rid of the stuff that maybe you assume they already know, and you can do some logical skips and jumps and jargon if you're confident they know that jargon, or if not, you have the entire thing ready to go and just explain it very clearly. I've found in my experience in the NCFCA that metaphors are often very good. Bringing it back to kind of very simple analogies of policymaking or debate as a game can be very good. It's also very good to reassure the judge that what you're doing is pretty normal in debate. You're not doing something super weird, unless maybe you are. But the idea of theory sometimes, I think, with new judges, they question whether or not they're like the debaters are trying to pull one over on them. And it can be good to reassure them, no, this is a normal thing that debaters debate. It's this kind of meta thing, and explain it that way, and just reassure them that you're not trying to be sneaky or condescending or something like that. So be prepared. That's what it is. That's honestly the answer to most debate questions of how do I do something. Prepare for it. Next thing, getting into specific theory arguments. The question is, counterplans can be non-topical, right? In fact, non-topicality, if you run a counterplan that's non-topical, no one's really going to have a problem with the counterplan on topicality grounds. And the question is, so is the negative team constrained to using the actor in the resolution, or can they use other actors? So by the actor, we mean the agency organization that is that the resolution says should do something, almost always the United States federal government or some government. And there are some arguments for why the negative team would have to use the actor in the resolution. The first one is that if they can use any actor, so not just the U.S. federal government, but any government in the world or any governmental organization like the UN, or even like companies and businesses or organizations or individuals, the argument against allowing that is that it's simply utopian. You've exited the realm of actual decision making in the policy sphere, and you've entered the realm of what if I was God and can control everything. And once you do that, you're just being unrealistic. You're being damaging to debate, because if the negative team had that authority to fiat that, as we say in debate theory, they would just win every debate round, because they could just say the world is perfect. Everyone will act perfectly. And then what do you don't have anything left there. There's no debate to be had there. The second argument against is that it's metaphorically unrealistic. If we're thinking about the resolution as saying, assuming it's the United States federal government, that the U.S. federal government should do X, the debate's in that sphere. What should the U.S. federal government do? And so in real life, Congress wouldn't say, well, we're not going to pass this policy because China or England or India or the United Nations should do this other thing instead. Unless they'd say the alternative is we should influence them to do this thing. That would be an interesting counterplan, but then the U.S. federal government's the actor in that case. But they wouldn't say, well, this other country should do this other thing instead, the end. When the other country clearly isn't going to do that other thing, because if they were, they would do it already. Or if you had evidence that this other country is going to do this other thing, that's an inherency argument. So that's perfectly fine. It's completely unrealistic. That's not how Congress actually works. However, there's an interesting exception to this that I find very intriguing, and that's the state's counterplan. So the counterplan is essentially, instead of having the United States federal government do something, we instead, as the negative team, our counterplan is that all the individual states will do that thing. And then you run the argument that, a federalism argument, that basically the state should be doing this thing instead of the federal government for constitutional reasons, for division of powers reasons, for limited government reasons, etc. This is intriguing for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it is sort of a realistic argument. Congress people do make this argument that whatever policy proposal someone has proposed should not happen because the state should do it instead. And secondly, Congress people kind of have some influence in what the states do. There's also another alternative to the state's counterplan, which is where you do it as a constitutional amendment instead of the individual state legislatures passing the policy. You make it a constitutional amendment. That one may be a little bit more realistic because Congress does have or can have some influence, a significant amount of influence in the amendment process. They can start that process. And the final reason why the states one is a little bit more intriguing to allow is that federalism and that debate about federalism is actually a really good educational debate, and it has good ground on both sides. So the argument that, well, if we allow this, it destroys the activity doesn't really hold, because that's actually a really fascinating debate and a healthy one, and one that's educational. However, that said, if your federalism DA is good enough to reject or to justify the counterplan, it's probably good enough just to run on its own without the counterplan. So think about that. Next question. The question was simply conditional counterplans with a question mark at the end. I don't know if I've ever seen a conditional counterplan in the NCFCA or STOA, or really even heard of one. There's two understandings, and I'm saying that as I don't have a huge amount of understanding about conditional counterplans as I do other theory arguments. I've heard two ideas, basic ideas for what a conditional counterplan is. The first one is basically when the negative team more or less reserves the right to drop the counterplan. So when they initially present the counterplan, they say that we could drop this in the future. We could simply abandon the counterplan and allow, we're saying we're going to potentially do that. The second way I've heard is where the counterplan is conditioned on another argument. So for instance, if they have a solvency argument, that says that the plan cannot function in a certain way, and then the counterplan basically does the same thing, but it dodges that solvency issue. They condition the counterplan to the solvency argument. So they say, insofar as you believe the solvency argument is true, we support the counterplan. If the solvency argument falls apart, we don't. I think those are kind of the two general flavors of conditional counterplans. Now, the first thing I'm going to say about this is that in the NCFCA and STOA, because it basically doesn't happen, to my knowledge, and it's kind of a weird, I shouldn't say weird, that's not precise. It is a fundamentally alien idea to many of the judges that there's going to be a huge barrier to overcome with most judges you encounter if you're going to adopt this kind of strategy. However, there are very interesting arguments about it. The argument against allowing conditional counterplans is essentially that it's sort of pre-ground shifting. It's basically the negative team saying we are going to change our fundamental advocacy away from saying that the status quo is better than the affirmative plan to saying this other plan is better than the affirmative plan. We're announcing that we may change that very fundamental advocacy in order to dodge arguments in the future. And when they do that, you get into all the stuff, all the theory arguments against ground shifting. Ground shifting being, traditionally, if the affirmative team changes their plan to dodge arguments mid-round. So if the affirmative isn't allowed to do that, why would the negative team be allowed to do that? That's, I think, a pretty compelling argument. Because basically what you're doing is you're saying we're going to just change what our basic advocacy in order to get out of arguments and therefore waste the other team's time. This is different than dropping other arguments, other types of arguments, which the negative team is basically allowed to do under standard debate theory in NCFCA STOA and in, I think, pretty much any other debate league in the world. When you drop another argument, you're still keeping the same base advocacy, and arguments against that argument can still have an impact in the round. So for instance, if you run a disadvantage, the affirmative team has the opportunity to turn that disadvantage. In other words, to claim that the disadvantage, the idea of the disadvantage the negative team presented, is in fact an advantage to the affirmative. Now, to explain turns real quick, there are basically two types of turns. There's a link turn and an impact turn. So for instance, if the negative team presents a pollution disadvantage, the affirmative team could either turn the disadvantage by saying that their plan doesn't pollute more, it pollutes less. That's a link turn. Or they could argue that the type of pollution their plan does is actually beneficial instead of harmful. That's an impact turn. If there's a turn on a disadvantage and the negative team drops the disadvantage, the turn doesn't go away. The affirmative team can still claim that turn as effectively an advantage. However, if the affirmative team presents a disadvantage to a counterplan and the negative team drops that counterplan, the disadvantage no longer has any relevance to the round. It's just wasted time. So I think there's a good argument that being allowed to drop other arguments and being allowed to drop counterplans are different things. They have different implications for fairness in the debate round and the idea of ground, of what is the core fundamental position of the teams. Now, the argument for conditional counterplans, or at least being able to drop counterplans, is that it is more in line with truth finding. In real life, when we discuss and debate and argue, we try out arguments and we learn new information from the people we're talking with or conversing with, or we're in the same academic field and doing different studies and communicating that way. And as more information comes, our position could change. As we get more information, our ideas about the world and what's true and what's not true change, and that's good. That is how truth finding works. And so if you don't allow the negative team to drop their counterplan, we're running counter to that idea of conversation and truth finding. And why should we block that in debate? Because debate is ultimately about truth finding. Now, the rebuttal to that is that while debate trains skills that help us in truth finding, it in and of itself isn't necessarily about truth finding. And this is very evident if you think about the activity. If the activity were optimized for truth finding, it would much more look like academia and a kind of high level stuff where people actually do try to solve things in the real world. There wouldn't be speaking limitations. There wouldn't be competitiveness with a end point with a winner or loser. And why would the affirmative then be limited to just the resolution? That doesn't make any sense either. But all those things I think most people would agree need to be held on to in debate. So insofar as we agree with that, we're not saying that debate needs to be optimized for truth finding. And therefore the foundation of the argument for allowing conditional counterplans collapses a bit. Now, I don't think it completely destroys that argument necessarily, because you could still argue that truth finding is a very important thing for determining what theory stuff we allow or not allow. It's just not an absolute thing that we should always optimize for truth finding. I think it's a fascinating argument. Personally, I probably lean against dropping counterplans as an idea. But if I was judging around, I'd certainly be open to arguments in the round about it. Final question, what is the Brightline for extra-topical mandates? And then the person specifies a bit more. They say basically all cases necessitate technically extra-topical mandates as a means towards an end. Some cases explicitly give extra-topical mandates in order that another topical mandate may be practically possible. Theoretically, you could have a topical mandate to support a non-topical mandate. What are the standards for accepting or rejecting any of these things? Let me explain extra-topicality as an idea with a little bit more detail. The most common form of extra-topicality that we see in plans in the NCFCA/STOA are funding. It's pretty well accepted that you can have a non-topical funding source. You could cut whatever random government program you don't like to get the funding for your topical plan. The reason that this idea of extra-topicality exists is because we see the practical need for allowing that kind of thing. We can't be bogged down with the idea that every single bit of the plan independently needs to be topical, because then there just would never be any topical plans, because you can always go to a more finer and finer detail. It would be a mess. So in debate theory, we've come to this idea that basically the standard theory is that you can have extra topical parts of the plan, funding, little workability bits in the plan that help it happen, as long as you don't claim any advantages from them, from the extra topical parts. So you could have that funding of cutting ag subsidies, but you can't have an advantage that says, here's why cutting ag subsidies is a good thing. That's kind of the standard position. But of course, this person's asking some really interesting questions about it. Could you, for instance, have a topical mandate that supports a non-topical mandate? And where's the bright line? This is a situation where I don't know if there is an exact bright line. If there is a bright line, it's basically going to have to be that the affirmative can have whatever they want in their plan. Topical, non-topical, whatever they want. But they cannot claim any advantages from any of the non-topical stuff. Those are what we would call extra-topical advantages. Now, I'm being very precise with my language here because it's often very, I think, a little bit confusing. As I was taught, and I think what makes sense, is that parts of the plan can be non-topical. So the ag subsidy funding is non-topical. When we're talking about extra-topicality, we're saying that the hypothetical advantage that you would claim from that would be an extra-topical advantage. I think that's a little bit cleaner of a way to describe what I'm talking about here. If there's a Brightline, you allow whatever you want. And the argument for this is that it still holds the affirmative team to following the resolution, because they got to have something to claim an advantage off of, or else they literally have no case. So you're still holding them to the resolution. You have a Brightline, and there's an argument that every bit of the plan that's outside of the resolution, that's non-topical, can be argued against and turned into a disadvantage, or a disadvantage could come from it. But the affirmative can't claim any advantages from it. So there's an argument to be made that practically it's restrained by the idea that the negative has the ability to weaponize it, more or less, to put offense on the flow against it. But the affirmative team doesn't. So affirmative teams are just going to choose to do it as little as possible. I think that's a pretty compelling argument. It makes sense to me. But there's some really tricky situations here. For instance, it raises the question, what if your non-topical part of your plan isn't explicitly giving you an advantage, but it is spiking a disadvantage? In other words, it exists in order to preempt a disadvantage and block it. Isn't stopping a disadvantage kind of the same as gaining an advantage on net? Another example is what if you have a non-topical part of your plan that the negative team runs a disadvantage against? Are you allowed to turn that disadvantage? Because turning a disadvantage kind of creates an advantage, and now you have an advantage against, or stemming from, the non-topical part of your plan. Those are fascinating questions. I don't have a good answer for them. But there are some tools we can use to think about these things. And this goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of really understanding what debate theory is about. Debate theory serves as a tool. It has a function. It is not an end in and of itself. It is not necessarily an objective thing that you can find the answer to. It's a tool. And therefore, it doesn't demand a strict Brightline. Now, there are arguments for why you would want to have a strict Brightline, again, on theory grounds. And by Brightline, I mean the idea of a Brightline is that it's very clearly understood when you meet the standard or when you don't meet the standard. There's no fuzziness there. It's a clear line. So here's some principles that you can use. First of all, I think there's something to the idea of extra-topical or non-topical mandates for workability versus expansion of the plan. So does the non-topical part of the plan help the topical part function like a funding plank? Or does it serve to expand the primary idea of the plan beyond the borders of the resolution? Related to that, reasonability. Does the plan to the average person read like it is supporting the resolution? If you said, I have an idea for how the federal government should change import-export policy, here's my idea, and a person looks at it and says, yeah, that's an interesting way to change import-export policy, even though there's some non-topical stuff in there. That seems like a reasonable supporting of the resolution. Related to reasonability is another interesting theory concept, that is predictability. I use predictability a lot when I was debating Parley. I think it's a really good theory standard. Predictability is the idea that part of what the resolution and part of what debate theory and even things like the time limits, part of their function is to create predictable ground. So in other words, both teams, if they put some work in and study, should be able to reasonably predict what's going to happen potentially in a debate round. And that area of predictability both incentivizes and allows preparation to enter the round more easily. So for instance, if there wasn't, for instance, a resolution, how's the negative team going to prepare? Their preparation would be very weird. It would probably be mostly on debate theory grounds or really broad hypothetical ground. And it wouldn't be as academically rigorous as preparation where you're actually digging into the issues. It would be much more debate round exclusively focused, not policy focused. So predictability is an interesting, and I think a very compelling theory standard. And the question is this non-topical part of your plan? Is it something that teams could have reasonably predicted would happen? Now you may be thinking, well, now you're just letting the norms of what people are used to determine what is good debate theory. Yes, that can be very useful. There are always norms and cultural stuff in debate leagues, and I think there's still a compelling argument that those things establish a certain amount of predictability, and unless there's another compelling reason to override those norms and standards, those are perfectly fine because they allow us to play the game of debate and get to the interesting, meaty policy arguments. A non-predictable thing is something that's unexpected. It seems tricky. It seems like a ruse. If it feels like that, maybe you could run a predictability argument on them. But of course, the best strategy with extra-topicality is to just figure out disadvantages against their extra-topical plan planks. Because like I said, the more detail they have in their plan, potentially the more disadvantages you have against them. So if you can find those disadvantages, I don't even know if I had enough. I wouldn't even necessarily run the topicality argument or the extra topicality argument. I would just spend the time on those free disadvantages they gave you that maybe weren't even needed. So that's something to think about. I deliberately don't have a lot of concrete answers here because there aren't a lot of concrete answers in debate theory. There are certain norms and practices that have become pretty concrete because they have very good reasons for them, but those are the things we don't argue about a lot. The stuff we do argue about in debate rounds and we think about outside of debate rounds is the stuff that isn't concrete by its very nature. So I'm trying to help you all get the tools to start thinking about this, but there isn't like a easy answer sheet. And even if I did have an answer sheet, so for instance, a pre-prepared argument or list of arguments or briefs against these things, I wouldn't necessarily even give them to you because I'd rather have you think through these ideas yourselves and discuss it with your clubmates and with other debaters throughout the leagues and have these kinds of conversations because really at the end of the day, that's the benefit of debate theory on educational grounds, is that it helps us think through this kind of stuff, these abstract concepts, which I think can be valuable. If you're just given, here's a list of arguments to run, you're disincentivized to actually understand those arguments. So I want to help you understand them by giving you some tools and some ways of thinking, but I'm not giving you answers here. And sometimes in a lot of this stuff, I don't have a clear answer. I think there are interesting arguments on both sides. So that's what I got for now. If you have any further questions about this is going fairly complex. Please leave comments. If there are other things that you would like me to address in future videos, leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you all. Thanks for watching. Again, I'm Mark with New England Debate. You can find other videos, other articles I've written, and sign up for classes for next semester, which are starting in just a few weeks at newengllanddebate.com. There's a big red button right in the middle. You'll find all that stuff there. Thanks.